Hello guys and welcome back to the second episode of my series about Italian presidents, where I don't just talk about the President of the Republic of Italy, but also whatever was happening in Italy at the time. Last time we talked about Enrico De Nicola, how Italy got itself together after the Second World War, and how the constitution came to be. There are a few things I want to mention that I forgot to include last episode. After De Nicola gave up his position as president in May 1948, he was the president of the Senate from 1951 to 1952 and President of the Constitutional Court from 1956 to 1957, so chances are he will also appear in this episode and the one after that. Also keep in mind that presidents always become senators for life once they resign, so they always play a role in politics one way or another after their term ends. Without further ado, let's get right into the presidency of Luigi Einaudi. Back in May 1947, De Gasperi created a new cabinet by expelling the socialists and communists, hence ending the national unity among parties that had saved the country from fascism. The fourth De Gasperi cabinet was a turning point for the country, caused by the start of the Cold War in March of that year. The Socialist Party was too divided, and the communists under Togliatti were too soft to oppose much of what was happening. In their defense, there was not much they could do, since De Gasperi was under American protection, and later we will find out that the US actually did have something to do with our elections, but that is beside the point. With the isolation of the Communist Party from governance came many new liberal policies to be applied on the wounded economy. Minister of Economics Epicharmo Corbino planned to fix the problem of inflation, tax evasion, unemployment, lack of resources, and the widespread of the black market by privatizing many formerly known state-owned sectors, such as infrastructure. It worked for the most part. In fact, the car industry was booming, and there were the first signs of regrowth, but as ministers like Corbino go, usually, he became widely unpopular, which upset De Gasperi, since he actually really liked the guy. Corbino got worn out after debating with the communists, who wanted the currency to be changed, so they could print more of it. De Gasperi wanted a man like Corbino to be president of the Republic, someone loyal to him that had strong liberal values. It was then he thought of the former president of the Italian National Bank, Luigi Einaudi. Now, what is there to say about Einaudi? Quite a lot, actually. Einaudi was born in 1874 in Caru, a town near Cuneo, and graduated in law in 1895, though he was also very interested in economics, and he decided to also study the latter not long after his graduation. At first he was part of Critica Sociale, a Marxist magazine led by Filippo Turati, but by the time the new century rolled around, Einaudi became more and more liberal. By 1919 he had become professor of economics and finance, giving lectures both in Bocconi University and the Polytechnic of Turin. He was then nominated senator by King Victor Emmanuel, although he would very rarely take part in the meetings. In 1925 he refused to take the oath to fascism and instead signed the anti-fascist teacher manifest together with people like Benedetto Croce, whom he was close friends with. Unfortunately, he would eventually take the oath in 1931 anyways, after it became illegal to teach without it. After a short stay in Switzerland, Einaudi came back to Italy in 1944, where he became head of the Italian National Bank. Then, when De Gasperi needed a new liberal to lead his economic reforms, he called Einaudi in to be in charge of the Ministry of Finance and Treasury. Einaudi would try to beat inflation by increasing taxes. In 1946, only 38% of government spending was covered by taxation. By 1950, it was raised to 90%. Another tool Einaudi used to fix inflation was the reduction of government spending. Throughout his time as minister, he would constantly fight against his colleagues who would constantly demand things from him just for the sake of political gain. Just 2 months after the new cabinet was placed, Einaudi had already imposed his new restrictions. Banks would have to release 25% of their deposits, and the currency exchange value of the lira went from 4% to 5.5%. 1945. Just after a few months, the Central Institute of Statistics recorded a drop in prices of about 5% on average, but for food wares it dropped of 22%. This was a clear sign that the lira was increasing in value. These new reforms reduced dodgy business practices, and there was a general increase in sales. Due to the objective success of Einaudi's term, De Gasperi then decided to ask him to run for president, to which Einaudi agreed to, though with conditions. He demanded the parliament not to pass any laws that would increase public spending during his 7-year term, and the removal of populism and political rhetoric from governance. There were actually many conditions, like an increased involvement of the Minister of Balance when it came to government spending, removal of the blocking of layoffs, and to slowly liquidate the blocking of rents. All these things were put in place in order to appease the masses, so by covering their expenses. He also wanted an agrarian reform and a transport reform, and wanted these projects to be handled by professors and experts, or technicians in political terms, and not random politicians who are more focused on being re-elected rather than doing the job right. It is unclear if De Gasperi was actually on board with all these demands, but they eventually came to an agreement, and Einaudi won 2/3 of the votes in parliament thanks to his reforms that saved the economy and the currency a few years prior. On the 12th of May 1948, Einaudi wrote a speech for the parliament. In his speech, he promised that his presidency will be characterized by concreteness and lack of political rhetoric. He will then talk about 2 principles. The first is to maintain the social structure that guarantees freedom against the state and corporations, and the second will be about the protection of equality and meritocracy. This was a speech that was appreciated in parliament and elsewhere, even though his role pretty much stopped him from really intervening in political affairs. He is famous for doing it anyway, through encouragement and by using moral persuasion. He is in fact remembered for signing more than 11,000 measures that helped the formation of the agrarian reform. He also nominated Enrico De Nicola as senator for life, together with musician Arturo Toscanini, who had escaped to the US after he refused to play fascist songs during his concerts back in the 30s. Toscanini was touched, however he refused the title, which led to a bit of drama since his refusal kind of diminished Einaudi's role and the Republic overall. There was even talk of taking away Einaudi's power to nominate honorary senators, which he was strongly opposed to, and so nothing came of that. A more difficult conflict was when a new law by the parliament granted constitutional judges the power to pardon people, which Einaudi hated because he was the only one supposed to have the power to do that, together with the Ministry of Justice. De Gasperi would go along with all his demands, not only because he was right, but also because he knew that if Einaudi resigned, that would really mess up with the government's national and international recognition. Throughout 1949 and 1950, Einaudi would refuse to sign 4 parliamentary laws, all of which went against his conditions of not increasing public spending, or his principle of meritocracy. Einaudi would fight for the transparency and equality of the institutions throughout his 7 years in charge. Luigi Einaudi turned out a very knowledgeable person that provided the institutions with plenty of insightful output in pretty much any field imaginable. Too bad De Gasperi got tired of him pretty quickly and essentially isolated him. Despite this, Einaudi still turned out very popular with the people. He was also the first president to move his headquarters back to the Quirinale, Italy's royal palace, which not only is one of the biggest former royal mansions in Europe, but also the place where the president of the republic resides to this day. Einaudi would move there with his wife, Ida Pellegrini, and the people were marveled by how modest and down to earth they remained, even though they lived in a gigantic mansion in the middle of the capital. I guess they can be comparable parallel to what Barack and Michelle Obama used to look like in the first few years in power. But let's get back to Einaudi. Einaudi was also interested in international relations. He would fulfill his presidential duties by meeting foreign leaders such as Persian Shia Reza Pahlavi, Swedish King Gustav Adolphus, Lebanese President Camille Chamoun, King Leopold of Belgium, English Queen Elizabeth II, and Japanese Prince Akihito, heir to the throne. Einaudi was really interested in the project of the European Union and saw himself as a federalist. Even though he was pro-monarchy at the time, he was a great admirer of Giuseppe Mazzini and he wanted to apply his ideals on a united Italy on the entire continent of Europe, although with a federal system. This outlook allowed him to become friends with Ernesto Rossi, the leader of the Radical Party. So far, Einaudi hasn't really made an outstanding impact on the Italian Republic, aside of some instances of moral persuasion towards De Gasperi. Though one thing I did not point out is that during this time, so between 1948 and 1953, De Gasperi had to change his cabinet a few times. The fourth cabinet fell after the election of Einaudi, because that is how it usually goes: new president, new cabinet. So De Gasperi made his fifth cabinet. In 1950, the police shot and killed 7 civilians during a peaceful protest. The national outrage brought the Minister of the Interior, Mario Scelba, to resign out of shame. De Gasperi would do the same shortly after. Though Einaudi still called De Gasperi back to the Quirinale to make his sixth cabinet. The sixth De Gasperi cabinet came to an end in 1951 after Minister of Balance Giuseppe Pella resigned after being harshly criticized for his austerity measures. With the elections little less than 2 years away, Einaudi decided to concede a 7th cabinet to De Gasperi. Speaking of elections, another big problem the Christian Democratic Party was facing at the time was the drop in support in the southern part of the country. This was due to the 1950s agrarian reform that abolished latifundia. The idea behind the reform was to sell small pieces of land to individual farmers instead of big landowners in order to make the market more competitive and make the families more independent. But it somehow led to people not being able to work the land as efficiently as they used to, probably for the lack of resources and machinery. Therefore, the food became more scarce and people blamed the DC for that. At the end of 1952, a few months before the 1953 elections, De Gasperi's 7th and last cabinet proposed a new law that would change the way parliament seats were distributed. It introduced what they called Premio di Maggioranza, a majority award, which consisted of bonus parliamentary seats to whichever party got more than 50% of the votes, essentially giving them a parliamentary majority. The Christian Democrats, even though they had lost a lot of support over the years, were still the most popular party, and so they thought that if this law passed, they would still reach the 50% in parliament and be allowed to keep De Gasperi in power for God knows how long. The other parties saw right through the DC's bullshit and refused to vote for the law which they called La Legge Truffa, the scam law. In fact, when it was time to vote for the law in parliament, all the left-wing members just stood up and left the chamber, including our friends Togliatti and Nenni of the Communists and Socialist Party respectively. Even the president of the Senate, De Nicola, resigned after the whole thing. Though since the DC still had the parliament majority in both the Senate and the Chamber of Deputies, the law passed even without them. When the other parties asked Einaudi to intervene, there was nothing he could do since it was out of his hands. Luckily for us though, the Christian Democrats only reached 49.5% of the votes at the 1953 election, which was not enough to get the bonus, though they still got a shot in making a new cabinet. However, when De Gasperi came up with his 8th cabinet in a row and asked for the vote of confidence by the parliament, he was strongly denied out of spite by the now even stronger opposition. This would be the end of Alcide De Gasperi and his supremacy over the DC. Now that De Gasperi was finally out of the picture, Einaudi had pretty much all the room he wanted when it came to the selection of the Prime Minister to be appointed in August 1953. He picked Giuseppe Pella, another Christian Democrat, former Minister of Balance, but also one of Einaudi's former colleagues at the Ministry of Finance, back when he was minister, and a younger version of himself in many ways. The cabinet was built hastily in order to be ready for the law of state budget. It usually comes every September every year. The parliament gave Pella's quickly built cabinet a solid majority, and things went pretty well at first. Einaudi and Pella shared the same views on economics. They were both favorable to austerity and private enterprises, and due to their virtually absent contrasts, the president and the government often worked together with harmony, unlike the previous times. Though not everything was sunshine and rainbows, because even though Pella was popular in the institutions, the people were not too sure. If you remember, Pella decided to resign due to his unpopularity just a few years prior. Luckily for him, just a bit further away from its borders, Yugoslavia was threatening to take over the city of Trieste that had been under the Allies' control ever since the end of the war. Pella made a very unusual decision at the time. Since Trieste was full of Italians, was a mainly Italian city, he saw it as a great chance to protect national authority. Therefore, he moved the troops near the border to send the message to Yugoslavia that if they tried to march to Trieste, they would have to fight for it. The tensions eventually died down and Tito gave up on his expansion. The result of this show of strength was a great spike in popularity for Pella. However, his party had mixed feelings about the whole thing, including De Gasperi. Since Pella needed his party's support to govern, he came up with a compromise to change his current Minister of Agriculture, Rocco Salomone, with Salvatore Aldisio, someone who, unlike the last one, was in favor of giving more power to the Sicilian landowners. De Gasperi declined this compromise, and so Pella resigned in early 1954. In 1954, Einaudi met with the Allies and the Yugoslav leader to work on an agreement for Trieste. The meeting was successful and Trieste and other surrounding territories were reintegrated into the Republic of Italy. Also, finally, after 7 years, Italy was able to join the UN in 1955. They would have joined earlier, but Stalin vetoed their entrance at the beginning of the Cold War, I guess because he low-key hoped that Togliatti would stage a revolution or something. His foreign policy made Einaudi particularly popular, but that would be the last of his accomplishments before the end of his term in 1955. In his last year in power, Einaudi witnessed two cabinets, one by Amintore Fanfani, who didn't get the vote of confidence since he was in minority, and finally the one by Mario Scelba, who was the Minister of the Interior that resigned when peaceful protesters got shot in the 5th De Gasperi cabinet. He allied with the Liberals and Social Democrats. The latter was a new party led by Saragat, who had split from the Socialist Party due to his more moderate views. This won't be the last time Social Democrats were integrated into a cabinet, and I will talk more about Saragat and his party in future episodes. In July 1954, just a few months after Scelba's nomination, the Christian Democrats elected Fanfani as their new leader. De Gasperi will die of a heart attack just a month later, somewhat unexpectedly. De Gasperi was a person that we covered somewhat hastily, but he was a very pragmatic person with a deep personality and strong religious faith. Just 5 days before his death, he said this to his daughter while commenting on his retirement. On a less deep note, his very last words were "Jesus, Jesus," because, as I said before, he died of a heart attack. Anyway, Fanfani is also very important. We will talk about him next episode. As his term came to an end, Luigi Einaudi didn't exactly exclude the idea of a re-election, although he realized that he did not represent the parliament nor the country that had elected him 7 years before, and so he made space for the next president, someone who was elected somewhat unexpectedly, to the surprise of everyone including himself, but he will be the first Christian Democratic president, the first of many, Giovanni Gronchi. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it and subscribe if you want to see more. Feel free to also comment down below what you think of Einaudi, or if you prefer any other president I'm planning to cover. As usual, be sure to check out the description. You will find the links to my PayPal or my Discord, where you can just join and just vibe with the community. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.